Today's lesson will cover Chapter 12 on services and settlements. Chapter 12 will cover 4 key issues. The first, where are services distributed? The second, where are consumer services distributed? The third, where are business services distributed? And lastly, why do services cluster in settlements? Getting into key issue 1, we need to cover a few basics. We'll talk about a service, settlement, and 3 different types of services: consumer services, business services, and public services. Now, when we look at services, we're talking about the tertiary sector. This is much more common in developed countries. A service is any activity that fulfills a human want or need and returns money to those who provide it. A settlement is a permanent collection of buildings where people reside, work, and obtain services. You need a decent number of people living in a settlement to be able to support certain types of services. Services are much more clustered in developed countries. This is because there are far more settlements and also a larger population of people that reside there, as well as people who make high enough incomes to be able to purchase those services. The 3 different types of services, again, include consumer, business, and public. The main purpose of a consumer service is to provide services to individual consumers who desire them and can afford to pay for them. Around 1/2 of all jobs in the United States are in consumer services, and the 4 main types of consumer services include retail, health, education, and leisure. The principal purpose of business services is to facilitate the activities of other businesses. 1/4 of all jobs in the U.S. are in business services. Professional services, transportation services, and financial services are the 3 main types of business service. Lastly, getting into public services, its purpose is to provide security and protection for citizens and businesses. About 10% of all jobs in the U.S. are public sector jobs. Not including educators, about 1/6 of public sector employees work for the federal government, 1/4 for one of the 50 state governments, and 3/5 for one of the tens of thousands of local governments. Take a look at Figure 12-1 located on page 432 of your textbook. This map indicates the percent of GDP from services around the world. Services are the major contributor to GDP in developed countries. That's why you see most developed countries in that darkest fuchsia color. Services account for more than 2/3 of GDP in developed countries, compared to less than 1/2 in developing countries. Looking at Figure 12-2, located on page 433 of your textbook, you can see that more than 85% of all jobs in the United States are some form of service. 1/2 are consumer services and 1/4 are business services. Figure 12-3, located on the same page, shows that recent employment growth in the United States has been in the tertiary service sector, especially in consumer services. To reiterate, all of the growth in the United States employment has been in services, whereas employment in primary and secondary sector activities has declined. Within business services, jobs expanded most rapidly in professional services and more slowly in finance and transportation because of improved efficiency. Fewer workers are needed to run trains and answer phones, for example. And on the consumer services side, the most rapid increase was in the provision of healthcare, education, entertainment, and recreation. In Key Issue 2, we're going to talk about where consumer services are distributed by talking about central place theory, the hierarchy of consumer services, market area analysis, and periodic markets. Let's get into central place theory first. Selecting the right location for a new shop is probably the single most important factor in the profitability of a consumer service. Central place theory helps to explain how the most profitable location can be identified. A central place is a market center for the exchange of goods and services by people attracted from the surrounding area. The area surrounding a service from which customers are attracted is the market area, also known as the hinterland. A market area is a good example of a nodal region. This is your region with a core where the characteristic is most intense. For some context, to establish a market area, you might draw a circle around the node or service on a map, and the territory inside the circle would be the market area. The range is the maximum distance people are willing to travel to use a service, and the range is the radius of the circle or hexagon, which is actually much more appropriate when discussing markets, drawn to delineate a service's market area. More basic services that people need access to may have shorter ranges. Another piece of geographic information needed to compute a market area is the threshold. This is the minimum number of people needed to support the service. A threshold must have enough potential customers within it for a service to be provided. Let's talk about why hexagons are better ways to explain where market areas are or the central place of a market is in comparison to a circle. Hexagons are the best way to explain where markets are located using the central place theory. Let's talk first about why circles and squares are less sensible than using the hexagon. Looking at figure A, we see that the problem with circles is that, yes, they are equidistant from the center to the edge, but they overlap or leave gaps. An arrangement of circles that leaves gaps indicates that people living in the gaps are outside of the market area of any service, which is not true. Now, looking at figure B, the problem with squares is that, yes, they nest together without gaps, but their sides are not equidistant from the center. If the market area is a circle, the radius, or the distance from the center to the edge, can be measured because every point around a circle is the same distance from the center. But in a square, the distance from the center varies among points along the side of the square. This explains why the hexagon is the best indicator, as it's a compromise between the two. Geographers use hexagons to depict the market area of a good or service because hexagons offer a compromise between geometric properties of circles and squares. Like squares, hexagons nest without gaps. Although all points along the hexagon are not the same distance from the center, the variation is less than with a square. Take a look at figure 12-5 located on page 435 of your textbook. This figure shows daily urban systems. And the U.S. Department of Commerce divided the 48 states of the 50 states that are contiguous into daily urban systems delineated by functional ties, especially commuting to the nearest metropolitan area. This division of the country into daily urban systems demonstrates that everyone in the United States has access to services in at least one large settlement. Figure 12-6, located on the same page, shows the market area, the range, and the threshold. The market area is the area of the hexagon, the range is the radius, and the threshold is a sufficient number of people inside the area to support the service. How expected consumers inside the range are counted depends on the product. Convenience stores and fast food restaurants appeal to nearly everyone, whereas other goods and services appeal primarily to certain consumer groups. For example, movie theaters attract younger people, chiropractors attract older people. Poor people are drawn to thrift stores, and wealthier ones might frequent upscale department stores. Amusement parks attract families with children, and nightclubs might appeal to singles. Keep in mind that developers of shopping malls, department stores, and large supermarkets may count only higher income people, perhaps those whose annual incomes exceed $50,000. According to central place theory, market areas across a developed country would be a series of hexagons at various sizes, unless interrupted by physical features like mountains or bodies of water. Developed countries have numerous small settlements with small thresholds and ranges, and far fewer large settlements with large thresholds and ranges. Developed countries often follow the rank size rule. Nth, the largest settlement, is 1 over n, the population of the largest settlement. So to explain this, let's say you have the largest city. The second largest city would be half the size of the largest city, and the third largest city would be 1/3 the size of the largest city. Again, this is much more common in developed countries. The exception would be primate cities, and these are much more common in developing countries. This is where the largest city is far bigger than just 1/2 of that population in the second city. So an example of this would be Mexico City, which is actually 5 times the size and population to its next largest city, which is Guadalajara. Let's take a look at figure 12-7 located on page 436 of your textbook. Following the predictions of central place theory, there are many hamlets, fewer villages, and even fewer small towns, and only one city in the region mapped here. Minot, North Dakota, which is the largest city in the area, has 46,000 inhabitants. It's surrounded by 11 small towns, 20 villages, and 22 hamlets. Figure 12-9 is an abstract model of central place theory. It shows the market areas of small settlements and that they are nested within the market areas of larger settlements and so on. So here you can see where the city would be located, where the towns are in proximity to the city, where villages are, and where hamlets are. As you can see, most of the services may be concentrated in the city. Also, looking at the rank size rule, we can look at figure 12-10 located on page 437 of your textbook. The rank size rule predicts that the 10th largest city should have about 1/10 the population of the largest city. This can be observed in the United States, but it's not as closely seen or reflected in Mexico as mentioned before. Geographers apply something called the gravity model to central place theory. And the gravity model predicts that the optimal location of a service is related to the number of people in the area and also related to the distance people must travel to access it. Keep in mind that sometimes distance is less important than the time that it takes for someone to get to a service. One of the major featured topics in this chapter includes the debated section of Walmart being either good or bad for a settlement. So there are benefits and harms that we should look at. Some benefits would include lower prices, employment to low-skilled workers. The locations are often in areas with fewer options as well. It's very harmful, on the other hand, because wages can be really low for workers to prosper. Many of them still need government assistance in order to live a decent standard of living. They also have imported products that could hurt American industries, and it can also hurt locally owned shops that are forced to go out of business. Walmart does provide many jobs, but its business practices are quite controversial. Another very important topic within this chapter has to do with food deserts. So looking at figure 12-15, we see that supermarkets tend to be located near high-income neighborhoods. This leads to food deserts in less prosperous areas. Food deserts are defined as areas with low-income residents and poor access to groceries. Poorer neighborhoods may not have the same kind of access to healthier foods and may only be provided options, or at least more of an abundance of options, to less healthy food. Figures 12-16 and 12-17 show pictures of periodic markets. These are much more prevalent in developing countries. They allow small settlements to have access to more services, but a few days a week or per month, like in Ethiopia that you see to the left. Merchants also travel to another village in China for a periodic market. In other words, in developing countries, the market may actually travel periodically from settlement to settlement.